Hello, very good morning to you, or afternoon, or wherever you may be listening to us today and watching us today as well. And welcome to another SHP webinar, which today is on driver safety. I'm delighted to say it's an association with ROSPA as well, and it's called Defensive Driving, Reducing the Risk of Collisions. The session is broadcast by SHP, and we are part of the Informer Markets Group. So my name is Mark Glover. I'm the editor here at SHP, and I'll shortly be handing you over to our expert speakers today. But as ever, just got a few housekeeping points to just go through before we start. As you know, this webinar is really designed to be interactive. So you'll see a suite of widgets at the bottom of your screen. So you'll be able to learn about aforementioned expert speakers, be able to download some resources related to this webinar, and also share the webinar on social media if you want to. Also, a full recording of the webinar will be available for you on demand, and it will also, I'm told, be emailed to you within the next couple of days. Also, I know how important that CPD is, and there is a CPD certificate attached to this. So again, at the bottom of one of those widgets, at the bottom of the screen. So if you want to, make sure you can download that before you log off today. Just quickly, if you can carve out a bit of time, just a minute or so, just to fill out our feedback survey on your experience today. It won't take long, and it really just helps us sort of mold these events going forward. Lastly, if you are experiencing any technical problems, please use the help widget found at the bottom of your screen. We've also got the Q&A area, which is really important today because we want you to send in questions for us that we can put to the speakers. But you can also use that Q&A area if you've got any technical problems with noise or sound, and we've got a team behind the scenes who'll be able to come back to you and hopefully sort it out. But as I say, primarily, that Q&A area would be good. If you want to send some questions through to our speakers, we've got a Q&A session at the end, so we can put them forward. Okay, so let's get on with the webinar. So shortly, you'll be hearing from Dave Mounsey, who's a key account manager at ROSPA. First of all, though, I'm delighted to say I'm going to hand over to Penny Brooks, who is the Qualifications Development Manager at ROSPA Qualifications. And over to you, Penny.
Thanks, Mark. So as Mark has just said, I'm Penny Brooks, and I work for ROSPA Qualifications, developing qualifications within the leisure, home safety, driving, workplace, you name it, we develop it, sorts of areas. So today I am here to talk to you about defensive driving. So let me begin by asking you what the word defensive means to you. Does it have connotations such as feeling criticised or being on your guard? You may be familiar with the term being on the defensive, which sounds pretty negative, doesn't it? But what about the other meanings, like the dictionary defines it as to safeguard, to shield, and to protect? So that's what it's all about today. And I think you'll hopefully come away understanding that defensive driving is as far from negative as you can possibly be. So defensive driving is an activity of two parts, both equally important. One, of skills and techniques to help you reduce your risk of collisions on the road by anticipating and avoiding hazards. And two, it's awareness of how your personality. So defensive driving then is partly about good driving skills, but also awareness of how our own motivators and tendencies influence our behaviour and our management of risk. If it helps, you can think of this activity as team-based, just as in any team sport like rugby, football, cricket, where every driver plays their part. And in this case, driving, everyone just wants to get where they're going and to get back again safely. And to do that, we all need to do our best to stay out of trouble, that which we may cause ourselves or that created by the actions of other road users. It could be you, me, the driver behind, the rider in front, or that person standing on the curb who may or may not be about to step out. By driving defensively, you can also improve your fuel efficiency, as well as lower your carbon emissions and reduce wear and tear on your vehicle's engine, brakes, tyres and suspension. all of which can save you and your organisation money on maintenance and repairs, not to mention reducing your carbon footprint. Driving defensively might not sound very exciting, but it is arguably the most effective way to economise your drive. It means there's less need for sudden acceleration, braking, or frequent gear changes, all of which improves fuel efficiency. This may or may not be a surprise to you, but it's widely acknowledged that human error is responsible for 95% of the injuries and fatalities that happen on our roads. That might be down to a lapse in concentration, an error in judgment, or just a choice to do the wrong thing by the human being sitting behind the wheel. For the drivers among you, true or false? You know how to control your vehicle. You're able to do this while driving in traffic. You know the rules of the rhythm. But if all of these statements are true, why do drivers crash? If we can do these three things, then there must be something else. Let me ask another question. How are we likely to behave when we think that we're right, even if our views aren't based on fact? Our attitude and behaviour generally come from a belief that we are in the right, but that may not always be the case. So let's have a look at an example. Here we have a driver on the main carriageway and a junction on the left. Imagine a car appears at the junction approaching the give-way lines. What do you think will happen? This is what the driver on the main carriageway thinks, but are they right? Many of you will have guessed that the car in the junction will wait for the vehicle on the main carriageway, and you'd almost certainly be right. But did you know there is no such thing as right-of-way in UK road law, even though most people think there is? How is the driver on the main carriageway likely to behave if the car on the left pulls out? Toot the horn, flash the headlights, or even tailgate the other driver just to make a point? But if they'd been driving defensively, they would have anticipated the move and not reacted. They'd have been aware of the possibility and also considered that the driver on the left may just have made a mistake. No aggressive measures necessary. The way we drive is influenced by a number of factors. One, how we control the car, whether we do it smoothly, safely, and competently. And two, how we do this in traffic, by following the rules and interacting with other road users. These are the two elements of driving defensively which involve good car handling and observation skills. Three is the purpose and circumstance of our journey, whether we're driving for work or for pleasure. Is it a routine journey or is there an emergency? Is it rush hour? Is it raining heavily? And four, those personal tendencies, how we respond to what happens around us. If we're impatient or get angry at the mistakes or actions of others on the road, and whether we're likely to behave in a risky way if things upset us. And it's that last bit, ourselves and our personality and how much we react to internal and external pressure, that's responsible for the 95% of all road accidents that we saw earlier, not because the car in a left-hand junction didn't give way. Our personality is a good indicator of how we're likely to respond to situations. Do you, for instance, know anyone who's been caught speeding but blamed the camera rather than the fact that they'd broken the speed limit? Let's use speed to look at some possible responses. Sometimes we speed because the opportunity presents itself. The road's clear, visibility is good. There's no one around to see, so you go for it. You can, so you do. Perhaps you just enjoy the feeling of speed. It feels good and you're naturally inclined to drive fast. So you do it, you like it, you say you do it. And lastly, you may find yourself in situations where you feel obliged to speed. Maybe you're late for something, or you feel pressured by other drivers to drive faster. You feel you're holding up the traffic. Whereas a different driver may not feel obliged to do what everyone else is doing and stick to the speed limit regardless. There are 5 driving behaviours that are so dangerous they're known by the emergency services as the fatal 5. You may or may not have heard of them, but you'll probably be familiar with them. and they're behaviours that a defensive driver would avoid at all costs. So let's have a look at them in a bit more detail. 20% of deaths on the road involve alcohol, and 1 in 20 fatal crashes involve drug driving. Driving with alcohol or drugs in your system slows your reaction times by up to a third. It affects coordination, makes it harder to process information, and leads to overconfidence and an increase in risk-taking behaviour. Now, whilst using recreational drugs is clearly a choice, what about prescribed or over-the-counter medicines? The effects of these may not be as dramatic, but they can still affect judgment and reactions. Driver fatigue is a factor in 4% of fatal road crashes and 2% of all collisions in Britain. However, it's likely that the true figures are far higher because fatigue is really hard to spot. When we think about being tired, what comes to mind is probably feeling sleepy and yawning. Things we would normally do before going to bed rather than getting into the car and driving. Related accidents between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m, which may not seem surprising as we're genetically predisposed to sleep during the hours of darkness, but also between 2 p.m. and 4 p.m. in the afternoon as part of the body's natural circadian rhythms. Other fatigue-inducing factors include busy shifts at work, poor quality or inadequate sleep, antisocial working hours, stress associated with domestic and workplace factors, or taking certain medications. As a driver, we're distracted when we pay attention to a second activity while driving, and we can't always safely multitask in this way, especially if the second activity is time-consuming or complex. When we think about distractions, we probably think about mobile phones, and using one while driving certainly increases the risk of crashing by 4 times. But distractions can come in many forms. A notification on your smartwatch, an instruction from the sat-nav, or your vehicle's increasingly complicated information systems. And then there are the less obvious distractions, having passengers in the car, reaching for a bottle of water or the sandwich you brought with you instead of stopping for lunch, changing the music, dictating a text message, or running low on fuel and looking for a petrol station or a charging point. Even looking for a house or building number takes your attention away from driving, and I bet we've all done that. When you're distracted, you're less likely to notice traffic signs and other hazards, and your defensive driving skills are greatly reduced. Speed is a factor in 28% of all fatal crashes. Driving too fast gives you less time to observe what's happening around you, anticipate the actions of others, and plan what you're going to do about it. But inappropriate use of speed doesn't always mean exceeding the speed limit. It also means driving too fast for the conditions. For example, driving up to a pedestrian crossing at a legal 30 miles per hour and slamming on the brakes, rather than reducing your speed on approach and stopping safely. And I'm sure the people waiting to cross would agree. Human beings aren't built to move at great speed. Usain Bolt, arguably the fastest man on the planet, could only manage 27.5 miles per hour. We're only designed to process information at the speed we can move ourselves, and yet we're doing that and making decisions based on that information at 50, 60, 70 miles per hour. No wonder things go wrong. And so to the final of our fatal 5, not wearing a seatbelt, 30% of those killed on the roads aren't wearing one. And that choice meant they were twice as likely to die as those who were. When we choose not to wear a seatbelt, we probably aren't thinking about who else our decision could affect. If you crash, wearing a seatbelt means staying inside the vehicle, which reduces your own risk of injury, but also the risk of harming or traumatizing others if you don't. Equally, the damage caused to passengers, who may be friends or loved ones, reduces significantly if everyone is belted in. If you remember back to the beginning, defensive driving is about staying out of trouble by observing, anticipating, and planning for hazards in the driving environment. Hazards come in many different shapes and sizes, and the definition of one is anything that may cause you to change speed or direction. And basically, there are 3 types. Fixed hazards are those that generally don't change or move. So typically street furniture and road junctions, where the hazards are obvious and easier to plan for. User hazards are anything that moves and which are unpredictable, likely to make mistakes or behave erratically, but equally may do exactly what you expect them to do, which makes them much harder to plan for and can really test the defensive skills of any driver. And surface hazards, which are also changeable and which tend to be affected by the weather. So rain or snow can turn a road surface into a river or an ice rink. Rain can turn painted road markings into a lethal hazard for motorcycle and bike riders, meaning drivers need to bring all their defensive skills into play to give them the time and space they need to negotiate safely. So how can driving defensively help us with all that? A good defensive driver will be continually observing their driving environment, far, middle, near and rear. They'll use their observations to anticipate and respond to any hazards they identify, and they'll come up with a plan of action to negotiate those hazards safely. As well as being aware of their environment and using good, safe driving skills, a defensive driver will keep any impulsive or risky tendencies of their own in check, particularly when faced with others' poor driving, and will make allowances for those who make mistakes. When did you pass your driving test? 5, 10, 20 years ago, longer than that? And have you done any training since? If not, how do you keep your driving knowledge and skills up to date? Whatever the answer, the same is probably true for many of the people in your organisation who drive as part of their job. And do you think it's any different for the majority of other drivers? Sadly, there is no requirement for any of us to take any post-test driver training, and there are no standards in place beyond the learner test. However, the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974 requires employers to take appropriate steps to ensure the health and safety of their employees and others who may be affected by their activities at work, and this includes the time when they're driving or riding at work. Employers must make sure that their drivers are competent and capable of doing their work in a way that's safe for them and others, that they're properly trained and sufficiently fit and healthy to drive safely and not to put themselves and others at risk, and that they're provided with information that will help them to reduce risk, even down to recommended tyre pressures. We refer to anyone who drives for work as an occupational driver, and training these drivers is important for many reasons. Driving is the most dangerous work activity that most people do, and it contributes to far more work-related accidental deaths and serious injuries than all other work activities. The most obvious benefit to defensive driving is that it can significantly decrease the likelihood of getting into an accident while driving. The more aware your drivers are of the road and their responses to what happens while they're driving, the more likely it is they'll avoid getting into risky situations. It can help drivers to better understand the consequences of their actions on the road, such as the impact of speeding and harsh braking on fuel consumption, vehicle wear and tear. In order to gain the benefits we've talked about, it's vital that you choose training and trainers who are qualified and experienced to deliver what you need. If possible, look for a standard that you recognise, which may be an approval or accreditation, for example, from the Driver and Vehicle Standards Agency, who licence all driving instructors, or an academic standard such as a qualification that sits on a regulated framework and which can be mapped to GCSE or A-level standards. So in summary then, defensive driving is a set of skills that drivers can learn to defend themselves against dangerous situations on the road. By using observational skills and techniques to anticipate potential hazards and plan for such circumstances in advance, drivers can reduce their risk levels on the road to themselves and to others. Defensive driving also includes understanding how one's own behaviour affects the safety of oneself and others, and making adjustments accordingly. And finally, a robust driver training programme that teaches defensive driving skills has numerous benefits for any organisation, such as improving the safety of their employees and other road users, meeting health and safety obligations, and managing fleet costs by reducing the need for repairs, vehicle downtime, and insurance premiums. Thank you.
Thanks, Penny. That was fascinating, and we'll come back to some points, I think, because we've got a few questions that have come through as well. So that's great. Thank you. Dave, we'll hand over to you now, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Penny. Plenty to take away from your presentation there. Good morning, everyone. Good morning from the UK. My name's Dave, the Key Account Manager here at ROSPA, working with our clients to raise and maintain driving standards within their organisations. I'll take a couple of minutes to try and put some of Penny's expert technical content into some more practical context, highlighting some of the common challenges faced by organisations and the solutions that we have implemented successfully to mitigate that personal and wider commercial risk. So road safety and driver behaviour has always been an area of concern, not just for ROSPA, but certainly wider commerce. And more recently, post-pandemic, there seem to be two main issues that organisations have brought to the table across all industries, really. Firstly, the drivers that have been off the road, whether that be through either furlough or job role changes, changes to the organisation, whereby individuals have been unable to continue to develop and continue their driving skills. Secondly, the cohort of drivers that were continuing to drive, but under very different conditions as well, with lighter traffic posing sort of less risk as well to drivers. So a lot of organisations that I was talking to around that time could see a reduction in standards through an increase in risk and incidents that were happening. So there are some common solutions to these challenges, which, following on from Penny's presentation, includes defensive driver training at the core. So whilst the technical ability to drive is generally maintained by all drivers, the challenge really is the driver's behaviour, including their awareness of what's around them, that decision-making process, and also their cooperation with other road users. And these are all addressed within certainly ROSPA's level 2 defensive driver training, and a lot of that's been covered by Penny. So when looking for a practical way to implement this training, we'll look to understand the level of risk in an organisation, just as we would do with all other areas of occupational safety. Why should driving and driver safety be any different? So with using ROSPA's driver profiler, we're able to ascertain a low, medium or high risk for every individual. And this is just a simple 10-minute online tool for employees to complete. And out of that, we can ascertain as to the level of risk that driver can pose. So initially, that allows us to prioritise the greater risk to an organisation and implement those control measures where they're needed, and that's via further training. So the medium and high risk drivers would be advised to undertake defensive driver training with a defensive driver qualification. And this course really, and Penny's alluded to this, really addresses the driver's decision-making process, focusing on the behavioural approach to driving that's been outlined by Penny. It's that decision-making process, ensuring that there's space around making those right decisions. To get the most from this training and ensure that drivers are fully engaged, with the organisations we work with, we stress that this upskilling opportunity is positioned as an opportunity. It's positioned as a positive. It's an investment in people rather than any form of reprimand or punishment for posing a potential risk. So that approach is very important. We've found that it creates that better engagement and learning from all delegates. So that's very much key to the communication piece internally. Additional solutions for the wider workforce have been successfully implemented to mitigate risk. ROSPA's level 1 qualification in driver theory. This online training is easily administered to learners across an organisation and completed in a couple of hours. This modular qualification centres around a mandatory defensive driving module, which again focusing on that behavioural approach to driving, making the right decisions, that awareness of what's around them, people working in conjunction with other road users, be it drivers or just other vulnerable road users. Along with that, ROSPA's developed more corporate-wide initiatives to include practical training sessions on specific topics, workshops, quizzes to assess learning outcome. These bespoke solutions are always based on those defensive driving principles, whilst at the same time being able to address driving sort of specific issues that organisations have. Could be speeding, could be, I don't know, slow vehicle manoeuvring for some industries, or any challenges that an organisation may have that we can address directly. Other ways to look at implementing the training. Some industries over the last few years have increasingly looked to set up their own internal training and development for drivers, and via ROSPA qualifications, which is exactly where Penny sits. Our awarding organisation, we can enable organisations to deliver their own defensive driver training to your own staff internally. So just to conclude, generally we're seeing a very positive shift across all industries to recognise driving and occupational road risk as a major concern, and more commonly now being addressed and mitigated as they would for all occupational safety risks. They're recognising that duty to keep people safe when driving for work. Penny alluded to the Health and Safety at Work Act there, a great example. So employers are seeing their responsibility and duty, and really taking that to heart. So whether it be at that policy level or direct training, ROSPA is very much here to support all our organisations, small, medium or large in any industry. Just like to say thank you for your time today. I believe we've got an opportunity for a Q&A session, so I'm going to hand over to Mark and he can take us through that.
Good stuff. Brilliant. Thanks, Dave. Really appreciate that. Really added to Penny's presentation there, I think, around the training. Funnily enough, we were getting questions in and you were answering them in your presentation. So I think that's really useful to be proactive to that. Really appreciate it. And just to say, within those comments, we're getting some really positive comments about brilliant presentation, really useful and informative to both of you, which I think is what we're trying to do here. So that's great. So Dave, actually, just if I could come back to you, and you mentioned about sort of post-pandemic, and obviously so many things have been affected by the pandemic and the like in many ways. But and if you're able to, and you touched on it, but in terms of driving behaviour, what can you say what you were seeing there? Were people keen to get back? Were they more careful? What was it sort of having a sort of holistic effect on things as well, with conversations you were having with people?
Yeah, so a lot of the issues were, I suppose, going back to basics, but that's not around the ability to drive. So ROSPA, for example, has advanced driver training and other qualifications to address that sort of technical ability to drive. It very much wasn't that. It was, I suppose, an increasing concern from organisations that people were doing silly things, for want of a better phrase, just quite basic, be it slow manoeuvring incidents into stationary objects, or a common one to people not being vigilant, and awareness was probably key. Awareness and observation, which we may take for granted, but where people were on the road still, with traffic being far lighter in different conditions, they weren't having to be observant as much or aware, because there weren't as many risks around them being posed to them. So I think it was just having your eye taken off the ball a little bit, and just quite basic incidents really that were taking place, and that was increasing for some people. So they wanted to take people into a level of training that would kind of give them those skills again, to make them aware, make them observe and understand what's around them, and take them back to basics, really.
That's a really good phrase, actually. The back to basics is one I use as well, generally across health and safety, like just the general back to basics of risk assessment, say, or just writing up a report or working at height. And it's something that post-pandemic, it's not that people have forgot this, but crikey, that period was so mad, and health and safety got a lot of focus then. And it's almost like a bit of a, it's back to normal now, whatever that may be. And it's interesting, the sort of psychological effect that it does have. And actually, Penny, I was wondering, because you mentioned in your presentation about drivers having an awareness and being aware of the effect they're having on other people and fellow road users. And I wonder if that was something you were seeing, anything like this at all that Dave was mentioned in what you were doing.
Yeah, so I think, and I'm going to go back to the pandemic again, but I think when we came back to driving after the pandemic, I think lots of things like temporary cycle routes had been put in place, and I think drivers were having to interact with more vulnerable road users far more than they had done before. So not only were they coming back to driving maybe a little bit rusty, maybe having forgotten, we say, the basics, they're also having to interact with a whole different set of road users. And it is that awareness. And I think we tend to get into our driving seats and we're in this enclosed space on our own, and we tend to think of ourselves as being separate, and we're not vulnerable to anything in this box. And I think that we tend to forget that box is also travelling at huge speeds. It weighs a lot, and it can do a huge amount of damage to people and property. And it is that awareness of, yes, something has really annoyed me. And yes, I'm now, thumping the steering wheel or huffing and puffing or whatever it might be, hurling verbal abuse that can't be heard through the windscreen at people. And even those things themselves are removing our awareness of what's going on around us, because we're so focused on our own feelings and our own anger. So I think for me, awareness is probably the biggest thing of all, because if we're aware of our feelings, aware of how those feelings affect our behaviour, aware of how that behaviour is impacting on other people, I don't like to use the word impacting, influencing other people. That's the basic thing for me. It's awareness.
Yeah, it's a good, very relevant word, I think. And actually, just to perhaps come back on that, I wonder, and this is a personal question, it's not popped up, but the more focus on mental health recently, and people jumping in the car, and if they've had a bad day at work, and they're going to be more susceptible, I'd argue it works the same in a factory and manufacturing. Someone's had a bad day at home, they come in, and I guess my point is, though, that's tough, isn't it? That also almost goes beyond what someone or a fleet manager can deal with. And I guess, and again, to Penny, is that something you're starting to, it's mental health and that sort of thing, starting to build more into your approach?
So it's always been there as part of, and I'm going to use the A word again, that awareness that comes with all of our training. It is about, how are you feeling? You know, what's making you feel like this? Why are you doing what you're doing? Why are you responding the way that you are? And that may be any number of things: work related, personal related, mental health related. It's developing that understanding and being able to say, right, actually, I just need to either stop the car now, take a breath, get out, walk for 5 minutes, just calm myself down, or not get in the car today and do what I need to do in a different way. So it's all about the person. It's all about that human behind the wheel. So it's everything about them, from their mental health to their physical health. It's
fascinating.
It's the whole person.
Yep. Yeah, fascinating. Listen, I'm going to in between. We've got a couple of technical questions, and then we're also these sort of bigger questions that I've just asked. So I'm going to go between technical, if that's okay, and then we'll come back to some of these more sort of horizon scanning questions, if you like. Someone's answered, which I think is a good question, actually. It's sort of, we need to get these definitions. But what is the actual definition of the so-called grey fleet? Who would like to take that one?
Dave, you probably deal with more people who are using grey fleet drivers.
I'll happily leave it with you, Penny.
Okay, so grey fleet in our world is people who are using their own vehicles to do work-related tasks. So they might not fall traditionally under fleet management, let's say. So they are the people who may sort of fall off that radar we talked about earlier around health and safety, who may not be considered for training, who may not be considered for, are they doing excessively long hours behind the wheel? Is their vehicle actually safe? Is it legal? Is it MOT? Do they do their vehicle checks and those sorts of things? That would be my definition of grey fleet.
I think historically the grey fleet has been treated separately to in-company vehicles as well. I think that's been a challenge over recent years.
Sure, thanks, guys, for answering that. Dave, I wanted to pick up on a point that you made, and it was about when you're teaching, you're training your drivers, how it's not about any sort of, this is your fault, we need you to, you've done something wrong. I picked up a word used, it's about them owning what they're doing. It's given empowering, I guess, is perhaps the word to use, and sort of like almost, I wrote down like a personal return on investment for these people that can then develop and are ultimately going to be driving safe. And I think that's a really important thing. I wonder if you could sort of touch on that again, really, or even elaborate on how important that is. It's not sort of the blame culture, I guess, of it.
Yeah, I think engagement in general in the world of safety is critical. It's a piece that I've been involved in for years in looking to roll out safety initiatives and sort of training programs. So it is key, and it's how individuals are engaged, what their perception is ultimately of what they're doing. So it's quite difficult with an organisation recently that we've worked with. It seemed that internal employees were discussing the result of their driver profiler, so the risk profiler that everybody had undertaken online and and were discussing whether they were low risk, medium risk, high risk. And it was quite evident that people with high risk were perceived to have failed. So it hadn't been communicated in the right way to the overall organisation. And it's a good example of what we don't want to happen. Ultimately, if those individuals are then getting an opportunity to undertake a regulated qualification in defensive driving, then who wouldn't want to? Wouldn't want the opportunity to upskill? It's costing that organisation some money to put into that individual. So, and just really hammering home the fact that we are investing in you. We want you to give you the opportunity to upskill. We want you to be of a better standard, and also not just for driving for work, driving to work, driving back from work, driving socially with your family. ROSPA is renowned for all forms of safety, home safety, leisure safety. There's lots of other elements that organisations want to look after that colleague, that investment, and it's really giving them the skills to better their life. And to make them safer at every opportunity. So it's really communicating it that way to get the best engagement from the delegates that will go on to the training, and make them hungry to learn, rather than it being seen as, right, well, I must have failed. I'm posing a greater risk to the organisation, and I'm being penalised to do some training. But actually, who wouldn't want the qualification to better their skills?
Yeah, sure. That's a really good point, as you say, and that can probably sit under the umbrella of most health and safety, I guess, when in training. Absolutely. But I think it has particular relevance in driving safety as well. Penny, sort of on that, and I noticed at the beginning of your presentation, you defined, the word defensive and perhaps the negative connotations that come with it. But then it was great. You flipped it around, and actually, it's a positive thing, and I think that's what that Dave's alluded to there. And I wonder if there's something you can add to as well in terms of reframing this perhaps.
Yeah, so we often bandy around two terms when talking about driving: advanced and defensive. And I think often there's confusion between the two. And for me, I always try to define it as one's an issue of hands and feet, and one's an issue of hearts and minds. So it's really about the advanced driving skills are being about how to take your car control skills to a whole other level, to smooth out your gear changes, to improve your anticipation and planning skills in a technical way in terms of using the controls. Whereas defensive is really very much about protecting yourself, creating space, creating time, managing those personal tendencies. And I think when you talk about driver training, I mean, most of us, I don't know about you, I took my driving test quite a long time ago, but I was so scared going into it. I was so full of nerves.
Yeah.
Fortunately, I passed first time because I really wasn't sure I could have done it again. And I think when you think about driver training, you tend to think, oh my God, I'm going to be tested.
Yeah.
There's this pass and fail. And I think very much, certainly I can only really speak for ROSPA, but we don't approach training in that way. We approach it in terms of building on existing skills, helping highlight areas where you could perhaps be improving. We don't say you've passed or failed something. We say, we need to work on this, and we'll work on this with you, and here's some things to go away and work on when you leave here. So really, for me, it's about taking that fear out of driver training in particular, because it's not like taking your driving test again. And as Dave said, who wouldn't want the opportunity to sit behind sit beside an experienced trainer and just learn how to do things better than you already do? And that to me, it's a complete no-brainer for me, but perhaps I'm biased.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good response. You're right. It's my mind was doing it when you were talking in the presentation about driving tests, and I was thinking back to when I did it, and I still get nervous now. And I guess that's something what people are going to be thinking as they go into training. And perhaps the message is not pass or fail. It's not that. It's learning. And if something
Absolutely.
goes, that's part of the process. There was another point that came up with, which actually I was quite surprised about. Penny, again, that you mentioned, and that was about the right of way. That actually isn't within legislation. I mean, in fact, we've got a couple of comments going. I can't believe that, especially with all the latest updates, etc. And so is that something you're hearing as well from people?
So I mean, I think the most recent updates, particularly when you are expected to give way to people at junctions, pedestrians waiting to cross at junctions, I think that's got an awful lot of confusion. What the highway code actually does is tell you when you should give way. So it actually puts the onus on the person who's giving way, not the person who thinks they've got the right to continue. So it advises you when you should give way. So that's actually what it says. But so many of us, and I was one of them till I looked at this more deeply, thought that main highway priority right of way. Surely those white lines mean somebody else has to wait for me. And in fact, they don't. They advise that person with the white lines, but they don't let me have right of way.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. That's come up actually, and that sort of changes my mindset now. Because I was always always an arrogant kind of, well, I'm in the right and I'm fine. I'm fine, and I think that's a really interesting thing to clear up. But thanks for that.
So that is what causes a lot of the frustration and aggression on the road is because of that perception. I think because people feel entitled to keep going because they don't have any dashed white lines in front of them. That causes a lot of behavioural stuff. But if you want to go and check it out for yourself, I think it's Rule 172 in the Highway Code.
Great. Emphasises one of the defensive driving principles about the cooperation with other road users, which is another critical piece. And that just is a good example that, in accordance with legislation, it's not your right of way, but actually in cooperating with other road users, that's how we can make it a safer place.
Yeah, spot on, Dave. And again, this is great because you're really touching on wider health and safety issues here. I think it's just that it should not be right. Okay, I'm fine. I'm in line with legislation. I'm in the right. Therefore, I can carry on. It's looking beyond that, isn't it? Really, and seeing, as we've been touching, the impact on other people. Just ticking that box with the legislation. Yes, we will have to be compliant, etc. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not going to go wrong. And stuff. And I think that's a big perhaps takeaway here. Looking beyond what's there. A slightly technical one, actually, if that's okay. Simon Rosser asks, and I'll see which one of you wants to field this. But Simon Rosser asks, is it time officially to treat the highway code as an ACOP and actually require refresher training when updates are issued? And he cites speed limits on roads in Wales change as of Monday 17th, and the recent changes regarding cyclists, horse riders and pedestrians a few months ago. So when things change, do you think there's any value in that at all? Who would like to have a go at that?
Who's going?
I would say yes. I think it'd probably be difficult to put any form of argument against that happening. ACOPs obviously widely used and relied upon within workplace and occupational safety. Why not? I simply can't think of a reason why we wouldn't.
No, sure.
Cool.
Yeah. Any thoughts, Penny, or should we? Yeah.
No, I'm with you, Dave. Yeah, nothing to add on that.
I hope that answers your question, Simon. Thanks for sending it in. One for Dave here, and it's more on because, of course, something that affects companies who are implementing these training programs. You know, there's a cost involved, and there's a bottom line for companies to have as well. But ultimately, I think in driver safety, there are real metrics you can see in terms of return on investment, I think, and in terms of maintenance, in terms of looking after the cars, etc. And I want to know, Dave, how you sort of dovetail that in, because it is, you know, you can put forward arguments for health and safety around with people, with directors who hold the purse strings, and you know, they're all they might be interested about is ROI, and they don't really care about if they're feeling happy and stuff. So, is that something you can sort of dovetail with the whole picture, and you know, as an important factor?
Yeah, I mean, there's similar challenges, certainly from a financial perspective, with all areas of safety, occupational as well, in trying to justify spend because of the in case argument. However, yes, we can. So with clients that have then produced data year on year, having implemented driver training programs focused around defensive driver training, have seen reduced costs. And that's costs not on their training, but introducing driver training program has reduced their bent metal costs significantly. I don't have the data as to what percentage below, you know, their original costs prior to implementing training, but has reduced their bent metal costs significantly. So, and lots of organisations are obviously utilising telematic systems as well, which actually is ideal, because that's the foundation for gathering that data that we need, that we can then apply these control measures of defensive driver training to the right people first. And then that's about using that data to prioritise where we need to put that training first. Those systems, we're not looking to change people's current processes and programs. It's about enhancing them, using the data they've got, making sure that we're applying the costs to the right areas to mitigate the biggest risks to the organisation. So, and yes, as I've said, it's difficult to I suppose see into the future and see what incidents may happen and apply. But all we can do is utilise the data that we have and the greater risks and apply that budget to those areas to mitigate those greater risks.
It's a good point, actually. And a few of the points coming up were around technology and these telematics and data insight, which is obviously something that's really sprung up in the last, I don't know, you guys might know better, 10 years or so, or probably more so the last couple of years, and sort of having that data at your fingertips to be able to analyse. But is there a downside to that tool? I'll ask you again, Davis. It's thinking, I'm being monitored here, and I really need to think about this and that. I know it's going to show up in my chart sheets later.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see much negative with it, because if it can change people's behaviour because they know they're being monitored, then that's great. Yes, you want people to engage fully to change their behaviours, but actually, if there's more of a stick, as it were, as opposed to the carrot, if it works, then okay. However, I suppose the caveat to that is there's lots of applications, there's lots of tools out there, some of which I've seen and used, some of which will actually give kind of in-vehicle training via an app or advice, etc., which is fine. But as with any practical-based skill, it requires practical training. That's clear, and whether that's manual handling or whether that's driving, it requires an element of practical training. So behind the wheel, there's nothing that can substitute for that. So yes, there's some great systems, and they work in conjunction with practical-based training where required, really.
Cool. I'm pleased you said that, because pro tech and moving things forward, but I still think there's always room for the human, and particularly in the sector that we work in, there always has to be room for the human. Penny, do you see this sort of impact of technology having an effect at all in terms of analytics and data?
Yeah, for sure. And I think just to go slightly backwards, when I talked in just a few minutes ago about the four levels of things that impact the way we drive, and levels 1 and 2, how you control the car and how you interact with traffic, those things can be trained. But telematics and monitoring are the only ways to measure whether behaviour is changing or not, whether it's changing for the better or for the worse. And I think increasingly cars these days come with so much technology on board. I think even that, without specific telematics, so much of that changes the way that we drive. Yes. Absolutely, of course.
There's someone's just popped in here a bit earlier and said the way to remove it is the way it's maybe going in 100 years, maybe soon, remove the driverless cars, etc. But that's probably going to be a whole new other webinar conversation.
Another conversation
in a long time. But I was expecting that to come through at some point. So we're sort of nearing. We're nearing the end, so we've got a few more minutes, and but I just want to thank you both so far for your input. Actually, this Q&A has been really good, and we've got more questions than we're going to be able to get through. So perhaps we can take this offline. We can send the questions through to you both, and then perhaps cherry pick, and I can publish that in an article as we go forward, because it would be good to sort of keep the conversation going from this. It's obviously something that's chiming with a lot of people. It comes up a lot of people, a lot of health and safety managers who might have fleet or have even a small fleet, a couple of cars that they don't really understand. That it's another thing that's been added to their hat. And actually, just on that, before we wrap up, and it's probably a bit late to sort of open up the Health and Safety at Work Act as a question, but this does come under the Health and Safety at Work Act. And as you say, there's nothing specific, but it can be. But you still legally, employers still have the duty of care here, and they still have to be on top of this. Without sort of seeing them overwhelmed with it, what's one thing that someone can do who's just starting out, got a fleet management contract? Where's a good place to start, to sort of bite size, if such a thing exists? And I'll start with you, Dave, if that's okay.
I suppose I'd be looking at the configuration of the fleet. So what I'd be looking at their vehicles and the demographic of drivers initially, and trying to understand that risk by the telematics, utilising a driver profile as such as ours, but just assessing that risk initially.
Penny?
I would absolutely stand by everything Dave's just said. Look at the data, understand your risk profile, and if possible, get to know your people, because I think that your drivers will be more willing to raise issues with you, whether that's around mental, physical health, shift patterns, whatever it might be, if they feel that you're invested and interested.
Perfect. That's great. Somehow we've pretty much gone bang on time. So I'm just going to say thank you to you both, Dave and Penny from ROSPA. And we'll, as I'm keen to pick this up offline. So again, thanks for what's been and feedback as well from audience. Really appreciated your input. So thanks for joining us on the webinar today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So, I think you'll all agree that was a really fascinating webinar as well, and some really good questions. So thanks if you did send in a question, and hopefully we answered it. If not, as I say, we'll try and take it offline and get it in an article in a couple of weeks' time or so. We've reached the end, I'm afraid. Again, I'd like to say thanks to Penny and Dave at ROSPA for providing that input for us. So as I mentioned at the start, if you want to listen back to today, you can do so with this on-demand link, which will be emailed to you within 48 hours. Share that with your colleagues as well if you want to. And just a heads up, because it's webinar season, we've got another webinar this afternoon, which is at 2 p.m. It's on enhancing health and safety in your supply chain by empowering your contractors. That's in association with Alcumus Safe Contractor. There's still time to register for this if you head to our webinar hub page there. And also the CPD certificate, you can download this at the bottom of the screen, hopefully. And take care. Thank you very much.